Welcome to the Devil in the Details podcast with your host, Will Nesbitt.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Devil in the Details podcast, the podcast where I investigate and expose ongoing, unlawful, non-consensual human experimentation on innocent men and women in the U.S. and possibly abroad. I am one of those people victimized by this atrocity, and now I am working hard to restore justice by sharing evidence and information in hopes of prompting a proper investigation. Join me in my fight and help raise awareness by tuning in and sharing this podcast with your family and friends. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Devil in the Details podcast. I'm your host, Will Nesbitt. Thank you so much for being here today. Let's get into it. A law is only as good as it is enforced. What do we mean by that? You can create laws, you can create rules, but if those laws or those rules are broken and there is no punishment for breaking those laws or those rules, then the law really becomes worthless, or it is unfair. Because the law should apply to everyone. Should apply to everyone under the state, country, or business or organization. It applies to every member of that entity. So for some people to be able to get away with breaking the law and others not to, then it is unfair. So that's what I mean by a law is only as good as it is enforced. This brings us to today's topic. Today, we will continue with part 3 in the series titled When Human Experimentation Is Criminal, where I read and analyze the article written by L. Song Richardson. In the last episode, we discussed the 2 biases. Today, we will be discussing the importance of criminal punishment. The first 2 parts of this series are available for you to go back and check those out. And so without further delay, let's go ahead and get into it. Part 3, the importance of criminal punishment. Punishing culpable researchers would send a clear message. Violations of autonomy and dignity are wrong, whether or not they take place in the context of socially beneficial research. But that begs the question, what is punishment? This article subscribes to the familiar view that what distinguishes punishment from other penalties is that punishments express moral condemnation. According to philosopher Joel Feinberg's well-known formulation, punishment is a conventional device for the expression of attitudes of resentment and indignation, and of judgments of disapproval and reprobation on the part either of the punishing authority or of those in whose name the punishment is inflicted. A necessary condition of punishment is that it expresses censure, judgment, and disapproval in a socially conventional manner. People in power, especially in the judicial system, they make themselves above the law. They create laws and rules that are more beneficial to them than to the constituents which they are supposed to serve. They make laws that are unfair and that in a lot of cases hurt the people when it should be helping the people to maintain order for the benefit of all, not just those in power or the rich or certain groups. They make themselves above the law. A lot of times parents can be that way. Do as I say, not as I do. They make these rules for their children that they themselves don't even follow. How are you going to go and tell your children about the dangers of premarital sex, but then here you come in the house continuously just adding more mouths to feed to the house? You're coming in here pregnant. You're having baby showers with no spouse. And yet you want to enforce the rules. Now it is beneficial to that child that they listen to you. Yes, what they say is true, However, if you don't model that, because that's how you reinforce your rules, by modeling them. There has to be a model. Otherwise, they're just words. And they're going to think, well, if it's good to you, if it's good for you, the authority, and you're doing it, and you're the person I should trust and revere and look up to, and whose example I should follow, do I go off your word or do I go off what you do? Because you're modeling this for me. And you seem to enjoy it, so why can't I enjoy it too? Do you see the problem here? And this is what happens when researchers are not punished for nonconsensual experimentation, because it sets a precedent for others to do the same thing. And it just keeps on going down the line. History keeps repeating itself. When we think of these experiments, we think of all of them happening in the past. Like, oh, that's just long ago. Please. It's still happening. Even today has been happening, and it's going to keep happening until we, the people, say, look, it's time to stop. And we make our voices heard. And we make sure that they enforce the laws. We make sure that the perpetrators are held accountable. And we make sure that there are more laws that are created to protect the people. That's the only way it's going to get done, because they're not going to do it on their own. Abusers rarely have an epiphany and just a change of heart out of the blue. Sometimes they got to be forced. That's why you have laws. You have laws to help them, to force them to do right, and to punish them for the wrong that they've already done. So this is why these acts must be punished. This is why They should not be allowed to get away with harming people for corporate and government ends. All right, moving right along. Part A, what criminal sanctions express. In his famous treatise, Henry Hart asserted that what differentiates criminal punishment from the civil remedy is the judgment of community condemnation which accompanies and justifies its imposition. One feature of the sanction that makes it a unique method of expressing moral censure is the stigma that attaches to the individual. As one commentator describes it, in modern criminal law, the stigma of a criminal sanction has become a special kind of remedy because of its burdensome and sometimes destructive consequences for the individual. The stigma is not limited to a conviction. The state's decision to charge an individual also carries meaning, for it expresses that the accused probably deserves moral censure because his acts justify placing him at risk of a conviction and its attendant consequences. This explains the feelings of shame and humiliation that often accompany a criminal charge. Furthermore, the criminal brand continues to express condemnation long after it is imposed. Except in rare circumstances, a person convicted of a crime must, for the remainder of his life, inform others of his culpability and blameworthiness by discussing his conviction on employment, education, housing, and licensing applications. A conviction also has political, economic, and social consequences. In many instances, it results in the loss of rights to vote and to carry a weapon, and of the ability to obtain public benefits, live in certain neighborhoods, and engage in certain types of employment. When the state utilizes the criminal sanction, it goes on record and testifies to the recognition that the conduct in question is wrong and the offender is deserving of condemnation and reprobation. The use of the sanction tells the world that the offender had no right to do what he did, that he was on his own in doing it, that his government does not condone that sort of thing. Through criminal punishment, the state vindicates the victim's value or worth. The victim has been wronged, and the state is stepping up to defend her honor, so to speak. The state's failure to utilize this powerful method of condemnation is also expressive. What a community chooses to punish and how severely tells us what or whom it values and how much. Let's read that again. What a community chooses to punish and how severely tells us what or whom it values and how much. That's a powerful statement, because when certain people are allowed to commit harmful offenses and get away with it with little to no consequences or punishments, it is unfair and in injustice to everyone. And many people lose faith in the judicial system because of it. Because when this happens, you send a message to people saying, you don't mean as much as these people do, right? Even though you pay your taxes like them, you vote like them, you have families like them. All men are created equal. That's true even if the Constitution doesn't say it. It does say it, but even if that line were not there, right? It's true not because the Constitution says so, but because of the virtue of your birth. Because you're here, because you're alive, because you were born. We're all born the same way. We're all born into these bodies. We all walk under the same sun. Inhale and exhale the same air. Walk on the same earth. Now, some people do more, others do less in life. However, that doesn't give you the right to interrupt someone's life or to harm someone's life or to harm another. Okay, let's keep going here. When the state permits an identifiable group to commit criminal acts without punishment, it sends a message of official complicity and solidarity with the offender, approval of the conduct, and disassociation from the victim. As a result, wrongdoers may believe that they are entitled to act as they did. Punishment is meant to humble the offender, to make him feel some inner experience of humiliation and shame, in order to annul or counter the message sent by his conduct. Letting the offender get away with it may lead to further bad acts, as offenders and potential offenders come to believe that their treatment of the victim or class of victims is permissible. The problems associated with failing to punish are apparent in the treatment of a well-known and respected researcher and professor, Dr. Albert Kligman. In 1951, Dr. Kligman, a professor of dermatology at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, was called to Holmesburg Prison to treat an outbreak of athlete's foot. Describing how he felt when he first arrived at the prison, Dr. Kligman exclaimed, "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time." For the next 25 years, Dr. Kligman conducted experiments on prisoners for the benefit of at least 33 major pharmaceutical and cosmetic companies, including Merck, DuPont, and Johnson & Johnson. He also created his own company to personally profit from his research and became a millionaire after he created the anti-acne medication Retin-A as a result of his research. The prisoners were not fully or accurately informed about the nature of the experiments conducted on them. As one explained, "We were never told what was going on. We never had a copy of anything we signed." One of Dr. Kligman's students acknowledged that uninformed patients were the rule. And Dr. Kligman admitted, "It was years before the authorities knew that I was conducting various studies on prisoner volunteers. No one asked me what I was doing. It was a wonderful time." Dr. Kligman faced no lasting repercussions for his conduct, even after the U.S. Food and Drug Administration discovered his questionable practices. The FDA initiated an investigation after Dr. Kligman published an article that described covering inmates' torsos with an industrial solvent that the FDA had banned from human tests. The FDA investigation revealed additional questionable practices. Consequently, the agency banned Dr. Kligman from receiving and testing investigational drugs on human subjects. This was only the second time in its history that the FDA used this sanction. However, prominent doctors and researchers spoke out in his defense and pressured the FDA to reverse its decision. Less than a month later, the FDA gave in to the pressure. The agency's capitulation sent a clear message to Dr. Kligman and the research community that his actions were condoned. Dr. Kligman received that message. He recently stated, "My view is that shutting the prison experiments down was a big mistake. I still don't see there having been anything wrong with what we were doing." He is still praised for his prison work and currently sits on the ethics committee at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, where he is an emeritus professor of dermatology. The failure to punish creates expressive harms. A person suffers expressive harm when she is treated according to the principles that express negative or inappropriate attitudes towards her. When researchers are permitted to commit criminal acts against individuals without punishment, it sends the message that research subjects can be harmed to serve the ends of research. The state's failure to act makes this message all the more powerful because the state is, or at least purports to be, an impartial agent of morality, with greater capacity to recognize the moral facts than any involved individual citizen. To paraphrase John Braithwaite, what is needed is punishment that maximizes the sense of shame and communicates the message that crime in human experimentation is as abhorrent to the community as crime in the streets. There's a book by Alan Hornblum called Acres of Skin that talks about this very experiment. Also, if you look on my page, there's an episode, I can't remember which number it is, either 5 or 6. It's called Secret Experiments, Black Bodies. And I talk about this particular experiment, the Holmesburg Prison Experiment. And you can actually see an interview with the author of the book Acres of Skin, Alan Hornblum, and also one of the victims of the experiment, one of the people who was one of the men who was in prison at the time, who suffered through this experiment. And it's very good. I recommend going to check it out. But the fact that Dr. Kligman was able to do this for 25 years is a long time. The fact that he was able to do this without any sort of oversight says a lot. And then the fact that after it was all over, he really basically didn't receive any type of punishment. I mean, the punishment that he did get was very pale in comparison to what the victims actually had to suffer through. But it's unfortunate because the perception, especially with prisoners, because there have been other experiments that have been conducted on prison inmates as well. The fact that people are looked at as disposable. I mean, they're still human beings, right? Even though they've committed crimes, and there are various offenses that people can go to prison for. But at the end of the day, they're still human. And because they're in prison doesn't mean you can mutilate their bodies and destroy their health for your own ends and for corporate greed. Because there were several corporations that benefited from that, including Johnson & Johnson. Several corporations benefited from that. And now, of course, not everyone in those organizations knew what was going on, but there were people who did know. And the people who did know, they should be punished too. Not just Dr. Kligman. There were several people who were complicit who should have received punishments. But again, I recommend going back and watching that episode, Secret Experiments, Black Bodies. I touch on that. I have some other experiments that I touch on there as well, with some interviews with victims of those experiments. Please go check that out. Moving on. Page 112, Part B, Scrutinizing the Alternatives. 1. Civil liability. Generally, civil liability is viewed as a means to compensate an injured victim and return her to the status quo ante, as opposed to a punitive device. Unlike criminal punishment, tort liability is not reserved for culpable actors. Even accidental conduct can result in a compensatory damages award. Setting aside the issue of punitive damages for a moment, compensatory damages do not express moral censure in the same way as criminal punishment, and thus do not carry the same stigma. Whether a harm is the result of an accident, negligence, or an intentional act, the amount of compensatory damages remains the same. Additional factors explain why the social meaning of civil liability is different from that of the criminal sanction. First, criminal defendants are afforded constitutional procedural protection, such as proof beyond a reasonable doubt and the right to counsel. The absence of such procedural protection in civil proceedings expresses the seriousness of criminal punishment relative to civil liability. Second, a finding of civil liability is not accompanied by the risk of imprisonment or the collateral consequences of a criminal conviction. Accordingly, civil defendants are not humbled to the same extent as are criminal defendants. Criminal punishment expresses blame and reprobation, a message that is largely absent from an award of compensatory damages. In fact, far from being humbled or stigmatized, compensatory damages express to wrongdoers that they are privileged to act, subject only to possible payment later in the form of damages. Thus, the compensatory damages remedy allows wrongdoers to convert property rules into liability rules at will. Finally, even the players in the criminal justice system recognize the symbolic and practical difference between a judgment of guilt and a finding of liability. Although compensatory damages may sometimes express condemnation, they are not the socially conventional way of doing so. Remember when you were a kid on the playground, you see kids playing and everybody's having a good time. Then all of a sudden, one of the kids just starts wailing, crying. They get hurt. And, sometimes kids are rough with each other. Sometimes intentionally, other times unintentionally. Somebody's going to get hurt when kids play. Okay. And the kid that gets hurt, they start crying and they're wailing hard. Our kids sometimes kids exaggerate. And sometimes they're really hurt. But it's always the kid that did the damage is always trying to shush the injured kid. Shh, oh, okay. Calm down. Don't say anything. I'll give you some candy. or you want to ride my bike? They try to bribe the kid to be quiet so that they don't get in trouble. And it's something natural. Nobody tells you to do that. It's just something that it comes natural to you. I've done it. I've had it done to me. It's just something you don't want to get punished. You don't want a whooping. You don't want to get grounded. You don't want to be told to come inside and not play anymore. So to prevent that, you try to shush the injured kid. And you try to give them something. And that's basically how compensatory damages work. Compensatory damages are basically to shut you up and to make you go away. That's what it's for. It's to shut you up and make you go away and avoid any type of punishment. Okay? Any type of criminal punishment. Because God forbid that these people be held accountable for what they did. And that's human nature. That's human nature. It's human nature to try to get away with something. And the thing with the researchers, like the examples here and other examples, in the rare case that they do get sued and that there is a settlement, what is a person's life worth? Elmer Allen and the other victims of the Manhattan Project radiation experiment, they settled a lawsuit for an undisclosed amount. And it's good that they at least got that. However, the victims of the experiment, they had since passed, some time before that lawsuit was settled. So they don't benefit from that. These people went to their graves having suffered those injustices. Now, their descendants, their children and grandchildren and, nieces, nephews, and whoever else, they benefited from the lawsuit, as they should have. Someone should be. But there was no punishment. There was no criminal punishment. The scientists and all these people that were involved should have received jail time or prison time or something. Or, even with the institutions that they were a part of, lose their jobs. There should have been a lot more happening than just, we're going to give you this amount of money, from what I've heard is it wasn't really a significant amount either. But for these people to not face any consequences is unfair, it's immoral, and it is wrong. And it's a violation of the law. So in essence, these people, the families, were paid to go away. They were paid to keep quiet. Paid for their silence. And that's unfortunate. They did the crime. They should have done the time. If you sat here and you committed a violent act because these were acts of violence. Okay? These were acts of violence. When you cut someone open, you take parts of their body and inject them with a foreign substance without their knowledge, that's violence. Okay? That's violence. They never expect to go to prison. They never expect to go to jail. Because you have CEOs and government officials who sign off on this. And they protect their own. But there are laws against this. Laws against it. There are laws to prevent this type of thing. There are rules that are set up within organizations that are designed to keep this from happening. And yet it still does. Continuing. An award of punitive damages is also possible. Punitive damages have been described as quasi-criminal punishment and are reserved for culpable actors. The Supreme Court recognized that unlike compensatory damages, punitive damages are specifically designed to exact punishment in excess of actual harm to make clear that the defendant's misconduct was especially reprehensible. Hence, there is a stigma attached to an award of punitive damages that does not accompany a purely compensatory award. Punitive damages are a conventional device for expressing condemnation. However, the relative strength of that condemnation is weak compared to the condemnation expressed by the criminal sanction. Punitive damages carry neither the possibility of imprisonment nor the collateral consequences of criminal punishment. Moreover, punitive damages are the subject of negative portrayals in the media as a result of the tort reform movement. The archetype stories of frivolous lawsuits that are rewarded by out-of-control juries paint punitive damages awards as abuses of the legal system. In other words, public perception of punitive damages as disproportionate punishment has diluted their condemnatory power. Finally, courts can reduce punitive damages awards at their discretion. If reduced, the resulting damages may no longer humble and shame the offender. Indeed, the reduction may even vindicate the wrongdoer. Assuming that punitive damages do constitute punishment, there remains an important use for criminal sanctions. Culpable acts injure potential victims as well as actual victims. Potential victims may fear being subjected to future harms. Unlike criminal sanctions, punitive damages cannot be awarded to protect future victims. Criminal sanctions, on the other hand, punish wrongdoers for injury to actual victims as well as injury to society as a whole. In sum, compensatory damages do not express punishment, and the social meaning of punitive damages is at best ambiguous. Use of the civil sanction as opposed to criminal punishment expresses that the offender's behavior does not deserve denunciation by the state. Thus, the state's failure to charge researchers for crimes expresses an inappropriate attitude towards the victim and the offender when compared to its willingness to charge people with crimes for committing similar acts outside of the medical research context. Page 116. 2. Institutional sanctions. Institutional sanctions also provide a means for protecting against misconduct in human experimentation. Both the FDA and the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, play a role in protecting human subjects. FDA regulations govern clinical trials of drugs and devices for FDA approval. Researchers who fail to comply with FDA regulations, such as informed consent requirements, may lose their entitlement to work with investigational drugs. The NIH protects human subjects by conditioning its coveted research grants. Recipients of NIH funds must assign an assurance of compliance with human subject protection rules, including mandatory informed consent procedures. Failure to comply with these requirements can result in withdrawal of current funding and ineligibility for future grants. Institutional sanctions can cause embarrassment, stigmatization, reputational losses, and even affect a researcher's ability to work in his chosen field. However, as serious as these consequences may be, they do not necessarily express moral condemnation. Imagine a doctor who rapes his patient while she is under anesthesia. Rather than prosecuting this doctor, the state revokes his license. Most people would not consider this sanction a sufficient expression of moral blame. Furthermore, wrongdoers in many professional fields are simultaneously prosecuted and debarred from their chosen field. For example, the state often prosecutes lawyers who have already been disbarred. Thus, the failure to impose both criminal sanctions and professional sanctions sends the message that researchers' misconduct is undeserving of the most serious sanction. All right, let's see what is next. Page 117. An example of the expressive failures of alternative sanctions. 18-year-old Jesse Gelsinger suffered from a mild form of a rare metabolic disorder that affects the body's ability to break down ammonia. He was diagnosed at age 2, and the remaining 16 years of his life successfully controlled his disease with a low-protein diet and drugs. Jesse's treating physician told him about gene therapy trials conducted by the Institute for Human Gene Therapy at the University of Pennsylvania, IHGT. Dr. James Wilson, director of the IHGT, was the trial's sponsor, which made him responsible for ensuring compliance with the regulations governing human subject research, including informed consent. Jesse and his father met with researchers at the IHGT to determine whether Jesse was an appropriate candidate for the study and to give informed consent. The researchers told the Gelsingers that the IHGT had achieved a certain efficacy with respect to the treatment of the disease. Due to the efficacy information and the informed consent document, Jesse and his father believed that the risk of joining the study were minimal. Jesse enrolled in the trial in September of 1999. 4 days later, he died. After Jesse's death, the FDA conducted an investigation that revealed that researchers had enrolled Jesse in the trial despite the fact that he did not properly qualify to participate in it. The FDA further determined that the researchers repeatedly or deliberately violated regulations governing the proper conduct of clinical studies. These violations included modifying the FDA-approved informed consent document. For example, the researchers had removed information that monkeys injected with the virus had become ill or died. Dr. Wilson and his research team had also ignored an FDA request to revise the informed consent document so that participants would be aware of serious side effects suffered by previous subjects. As a result, neither Jesse nor his father was aware of these risks. According to Jesse's father, Jesse and I were told that a prior patient, the patient before him, had shown a clinical improvement of 50% in her ability to eliminate ammonia from her system. After Jesse's death, I discovered that no efficacy was achieved at all in the patient. I had no idea that there was no success in gene therapy before my son's participation in this. Nobody relayed that information to me. I was under the impression this worked. I found out it was an experiment. The FDA found numerous additional violations, including failures to make required disclosures to the FDA, which may have brought the trial to a stop before Jesse enrolled. Upon completing its investigation into Jesse's death, the FDA commenced administrative proceedings to disqualify Dr. Wilson from conducting further clinical studies. The government eventually settled a civil suit with the University of Pennsylvania for violations of the Civil False Claims Act. The settlement with the government imposed a number of sanctions upon Dr. Wilson that may, upon cursory inspection, appear to express punishment. For 5 years, the settlement prohibits Dr. Wilson from serving as a sponsor in any FDA clinical trial and from conducting human subject research without the supervision of a monitor. Additionally, for 3 years, the settlement prohibited him from conducting more than one experiment at a time. It also required him to lecture and author an article on the lessons learned from this study and to advocate for inclusion of any statement from those affected by the study. Example, the Gelsinger family. Closer scrutiny of these responses to his misconduct, however, leads to the conclusion that they likely do not constitute punishment. The settlement does not permanently bar Dr. Wilson from serving as a trial sponsor or from conducting human subject research. Rather, during the period of restriction, the settlement not only allows him to serve in other capacities, but also permits him to conduct research on humans as long as a monitor is present. The requirement of a monitor may bruise the ego of someone of his stature. However, its insufficiency as punishment is demonstrated if we imagine similar treatment of the more common criminal. Imagine that a bank employee is guilty of embezzlement. Would we believe that he was punished if, rather than facing criminal prosecution, he was assigned a monitor to work with him for the next 5 years to ensure that he does not attempt to embezzle more funds during that time period? Once the time period of the FDA sanctions expires, Dr. Wilson is free to continue his work without restriction. Dr. Wilson has never apologized to the Gelsinger family. He still conducts research and remains a tenured professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine and chairman of its molecular and cellular engineering department. Furthermore, Dr. Wilson lost none of his profits, despite the fact that at the time of Jesse's death, he had financial interest in the study that may explain the motive behind his misconduct. Although the Gelsinger family sued Dr. Wilson and the university, the case was settled, and only the university paid an undisclosed sum. The use of alternative sanctions resulted in Dr. Wilson receiving better treatment than similarly situated offenders. The failure to utilize criminal punishment expresses that Dr. Wilson is entitled to different or special treatment from the average offender because he is a well-respected and talented doctor conducting socially beneficial research. While he may have suffered some short-term humiliation, the state treated him very differently than it does other offenders who have caused the death of another individual. The criminal brand has symbolic, practical, and expressive significance that other sanctions do not. It is rife with notions of censure and blameworthiness and expresses the imposition of punishment, which includes not only the potential loss of liberty, but also a host of collateral consequences. The use of any sanctions short of criminal punishment risk causing expressive harm because the message is that what was done to the victim does not deserve criminal punishment and its collateral consequences. In other words, it is acceptable for this offender to treat this victim in this manner. Government agencies must do their jobs. Government agencies are there for the people, not for themselves. They're there for the people. And everything that they do should be in the best interest of the people and not just themselves. And they need to listen to the people. Because how can you serve the people when you don't listen to the people? You have to listen to the people and understand who they are and what they want. And when we come to you with a problem, we should be heard and action should be taken. Regardless of who committed the act. You can't just protect your friends, your fellow politicians, your fellow law enforcement agents. You can't just protect them and disregard the everyday man who in many cases helped put you in office. You serve the people. You all took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. What you're really promising is to defend the people and to defend the principles of the Constitution, which protects and provides for the people. That's what it's there for. Non-consensual human experimentation is wrong, and it should not be tolerated under any circumstance. Take 4 or 5. Non-consensual human experimentation is wrong, and it is harmful, and it should not be tolerated under any circumstance, regardless of the innovations that come about because of it. No matter what discoveries you make because of it, because you are harming people in order to do it. If people do not consent to it, it should not be done. It just shouldn't. You can't just treat people as though they are disposable. It is wrong. And it should be punished if it happens. And the punishments take 5. The punishments should fit the crime. The punishments should fit the crime. You can't perform harmful experiments that hurt, injure, maim, or even kill another human being for your own purposes and get away with it. The punishment must fit the crime. The punishment must fit the crime. The reason that these experiments are allowed to continue the way they have Take 7. The reason that these experiments continue to happen is because scientists, researchers, universities, and government agencies are just so bold about it because they know that they can do it and get away with it. When people try to speak out against it, their voices are not heard or they're drowned out by misinformation and doubt and disbelief. They're not taken seriously. Until something happens. Or until it's one of them. And that should not be the case. Government agencies, especially the agencies like the FDA and ethics boards that are specifically set up for this very thing, you fail the people when you do not act. You fail the people when you don't act. You must act. You must take action. And the scientists and the researchers and the doctors and the government agencies, everyone who was complicit, everyone who was involved should see some jail time. Especially those who are performing the experiments, the ones who are collecting the data. They know that what they do is wrong. They know that they're hurting people. It's intentional. It's not by accident. There's no way that you don't know that if you inject someone with some type of substance, with radiation or whatever, you have to know that that is going to harm them. And you know this because you didn't ask if you could do it. Because you know, if you were to sit down with this person and tell them and say, hey, when I inject this plutonium into you, it's going to cause this kind of reaction in your body, and you could very well die because of it. Most of the time, these people are going to say no. They're going to tell you to go to hell. This is why they just do it anyway, without asking. Not only should these researchers and government employees and government contractors, not only should they lose their jobs, they should also be put into prison. In addition to having to pay financially. The victims deserve that. The victims deserve it. And you should get what you deserve. And I'm confident that this will be the case. I'm confident that with the current experiment with electromagnetic radiation being blasted onto a small population in the U.S. and possibly abroad, I'm confident that this will be exposed and that there will be severe punishment, not just compensatory damages, but also criminal punishment. This concludes today's episode. Thank you for joining me today. Be sure to stay tuned for the next episode where I will get into part 4, the utility of desert. That's going to be another good episode. Also, please be sure to sign the petitions. I have 2 petitions. I would appreciate it if you would sign both of those. One is on change.org and the other is on Color of Change. The links are included in my link tree. You'll see the links for those petitions, as well as links that'll take you to my social media pages. Please follow me on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, and share those as well. Also, the podcast, you can find the podcast on Spotify and YouTube. It's also listed on some others like iHeartRadio and Apple Music. You can find them on there to listen to. But on YouTube and Spotify, you can actually see the video. The other platforms, you can only hear the audio. So if you want to watch the video, you can. If you want to just hear the audio, you can do that as well. So again, if you go to my link tree, which is linktr.ee/will-to-live-us. And you should have seen it all throughout the video on the lower third, including all of my social media handles. Again, please follow me there, sign the petitions, and that's it. So thank you once again for joining me. And I will see you in 2025. Thanks again. Take care. Peace.